Hi there, welcome to Whole Life and welcome to September. Amazingly, we're now in month 9 of 2020 and what a year it has been. And I want to just spend a few minutes today reflecting a little bit on the way forward. In a conversation recently with someone from our church, I pointed out how relatively easy it was back in March 2020 for things to close down in terms of society, in terms of going out, in terms of doing things, the normal things that we took so much for granted, but also church services, how we used to get together. And for those of us who have been in church our whole lives, this has been our entire experience. And stopping it was a shock to the system, but it was relatively straightforward. Restarting is infinitely harder, for all sorts of reasons, not least of which the practicalities of meeting in a COVID secure way. And it's true, of course, for those in education, in industry. Just not too far from here, there's a building site, and I saw today that some of the workers are back on site. They'd been off site since probably March, April time. And I was wondering when that rebuilding was going to begin again. And I sympathise very much with people in these different sectors of our society who are thinking, well, how do we go forward in this new normal? How do we carry on? How do we go back to the way things were? And until a little while ago, I was part of a Facebook group of church leaders who often would try out this thing, we can't wait to get back to the way things were. And this is a very controversial thing, of course, and which is not an issue for me, nor is it a reason to sidestep it. But the question is, of course, do we want to go back to the way things were? What is it about the way things were in terms of church life or in terms of society generally? Do we want to go back and pick up again? Or what things do we feel happy to remain on the floor? We dropped them in March, April, May. How many do we want to pick up again? What is God saying to us? Is this a golden opportunity to re-examine what's really important? And I think God gives us these opportunities from time to time to re-evaluate. It might be to do with our work-life balance, or to perhaps come up with a work-life balance because we don't really have one. It could be to re-evaluate how we spend time with our family and friends. Where is God in our schedule? Where is time for relaxation? Where is time for us to be creative and thereby reflect the image of God? Time to reevaluate what God's mission is for his ecclesia, his church. And are we simply to carry on in the way that we've always carried on? And to go back to this question, what has always been like this, hasn't it? Well, perhaps it hasn't actually always been like anything. It's just that we have different expressions of church in different parts of the world and different parts of history. Having been in Africa and Europe and North America and South America now too, I've seen people worship 4 different continents in ways that in some respects are remarkably similar and yet in other respects are remarkably different. And it is important for us to realize that there's no one way to worship. There's no one way to be ecclesia. There's no one way to be the missional movement that God has called us to be. And we have to ask God, what is he saying to us in our time, for our place, for our people? Where do we go from here? How do we move forward? How do we step into all that God has for us? And I was recently challenged some months ago now, perhaps even a year ago, by Francis Chan's book about letters to the church. And Francis Chan packs no punches. He's about as subtle as a brick and says certain things that are particularly relevant if you're in an American megachurch culture. And many of us here in the UK, of course, are not in that culture at all, and some of it is alien to us. And had I not lived in America for a number of years, perhaps some of it would not have made so much sense to me. And yet the underlying principles of re-examining what it is to be a missional culture, what it is to be a community of people that connect with God, is so very important. And Francis Chan and others, and recently I was encouraged by a good friend of mine, to get this book by Alan Hirsch from Australia called The Forgotten Ways. And this is reactivating apostolic movements. Now, I didn't realize how big a book this is. I mean, it's 330 odd pages and lots of small print, not much white space, and a certain lack of pictures. Nevertheless, I'm starting to get into this, and it's a really challenging book, and it's encouraging as we look to think, well, what really is ecclesia? What is it we want to get back to? Is the thing that we want to get back to what we should be going back to, or is this a chance for a renaissance? Is this a chance for a rebuilding, a renewal, for a revival? Is this a chance for us to renew what God has in mind for his people? And one of the things that Hirsch does in this book, at the very beginning, he talks about the spectacular growth of the early church between, say, AD 100 and 310, before Constantine messed everything up by making Christianity legal. And he compares that with the tremendous growth of the church in China after Mao Zedong. So it's post-World War II, and when religious tolerance in China was at an all-time low, which have particularly affected Christians, but other groups as well. And then once the bamboo curtain had lifted and foreigners were allowed back into China, probably back in the 80s, I would imagine, and subsequently, they found that the church, instead of being suppressed and compressed and really just a faint glimmer of what it used to be, had in fact, contrary to their expectations, expanded beyond anything they could ever have imagined. And he identifies his 6 particular traits. I just want to go through these very briefly and then throw these out to you. I want to be a little bit provocative and say, well, maybe what we are aiming to reclaim is less than God has for us. So he's asked this question, how do you think those early Christians did it? And this is also the case in China. Here are some qualifications, he says. First of all, they were members of an illegal religion throughout this period. They were members of an illegal religion throughout the period, because that was true in the early church. It was also true in China. And the church under persecution has obviously suffered hugely. And we don't say these things in a blasé way, because we know that people lost their lives, their livelihoods. There were times when people suffered in ways that those of us who live in the sheltered West can only imagine. Some of the things we may see in a film or a TV series, which we think are too graphic to look at in terms of persecution and death, will be, even today, their current experience. So I don't say that lightly. But the first thing was they were members of an illegal religion. And I think when people today often say, we want to go back to when the UK, particularly England, but UK in general, was a Christian country. Well, I'm not sure that the UK ever was a Christian country. And in fact, when the movement to push Christianity to the front and make it up close and personal in our politics and in our sociology has huge dangers. Because throughout the early church period, it was a subversive movement coming up from underneath. It was not a movement that was being imposed from on top. And when Constantine came on the scene, and if it was true that he gave his life to Jesus and then he legalized Christianity, from that point, things, generally speaking, went very, very wrong. So the idea of being a subversive, perhaps anti-government or anti-societal movement is entirely biblical and was a hallmark of the growth of the early church and the church in China. Secondly, they didn't have church buildings as we know them. So there was no rent to pay, there were no utility bills to pay, there were none of these things, there's no maintenance to do, there was no cleaning rota needed. Buildings facilitate ministry, and I've been in churches through my whole life that have owned their own buildings, and they are without question hugely useful. They can also be something tied around our necks that just brings us down, and they can be a real pain. Working in the last couple of years with another church here in this part of England, I know that they look for a building or they looking to rebuild, in fact, on a new building. And one of the things they miss are some practical things that we take for granted in our own church. For example, the ability to practice their band practice during the week, where they have no premises to do that because they don't yet own their own building. It's being built as we speak. And so there are practical benefits of having our own building, without question. The fact that we can very often just have a meeting on the spur of the moment, had we not had COVID anyway, means that we are more, it's easy just to do things without too much forethought. And that's a great plus. There are some negatives, of course, not least of which we want to fill the building so the numbers get bigger and bigger, and our goal is to grow the numbers. Or in fact, maybe our goal should be to grow the kingdom. Just a thought. Perhaps God's heart is for kingdom growth, not church growth. And the two aren't necessarily the same. Thirdly, they didn't even have the scriptures as we now have them. So they would have had the Old Testament. They were the New Testament, certainly in the first century. They were living it. They would have had the letters of Paul and others passed around, plus other letters that were eventually not put into the Bible. They would have had the Old Testament, and for most of them, they'd be reading it in Greek, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. So they would have had part of the revelation that we have now, and yet they grew in an incredible way. It's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge for us to think about the things that we feel are indispensable. They had God, they had Old Testament revelation, they had the beginnings of the New Testament, as we would call it. They had no buildings, they were persecuted, and yet they grew. Fourthly, they didn't have a formal institution or the professional type of leadership normally associated with it. So they didn't have organized religion. And I use religion there in a general term to do with faith. And I know we often say, and I've said it myself, Christianity is not a religion, it's a faith. And so don't get hung up on the word religion. Religion is a good word, and we want to redeem that in this context. The religious institution that we have made out of ecclesia, out of God's idea of a called out people, the church, can sometimes hinder more than it can assist. And they didn't have that. In some ways, you might say, well, they were free to follow the leading of God. And look what happened in those two scenarios, the first century in the Middle East and the 20th century in China. Different contexts, different places, different periods of history, different millennia, and yet God still worked in remarkable ways in both of those situations. Of course, in China, often they didn't have any scriptures, or they only had part of a book, and they would share that and people would memorize it. They didn't have buildings that they could use, and of course things were illegal. There was no instituted church or institutionalized church in China. They didn't have professional leadership. So today, of course, we have people who are church leaders in different denominations and different groupings. They become ordained and they lead ministry. I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I'm an ordained minister. I'm simply saying that that alone is not sufficient. And when that gets in the way of people taking on board for themselves their own responsibilities and the privileges of following God, it can actually be a hindrance. And I've always been a great believer that the split between clergy and laity, which has been imposed by people, not by God, needs to be done away with. We're all ministers together. We may not all be pastors, but that should simply be because our giftings are in other areas. We are not all called reverend, and life goes really well. So that's a challenge, isn't it? For the early church, they didn't have it, and they grew like crazy. For the Chinese church, they didn't have it, and they grew like crazy. See, there were apostolic type movements that went through those early parts of the church in history and also in China. Even though people may not have been called apostle, and let's not get hung up on titles, because that's very divisive, but that movement of God, that issue of God saying, this is my way, walk in it. It was one of those organic movements of people that developed that resulted in huge life change for people as individuals and for communities and for societies. So the church exploded without these things that we feel are indispensable. Makes us wonder really what's that important. This is a controversial thought. They didn't have seeker-sensitive services, youth groups, worship bands, seminaries, commentaries, and so on, all the things that we assume we need to lead healthy church. Now, I'm not knocking a particular church's perspective. I'm simply saying that this, from my own study of the early church, and I haven't studied the Chinese church, but I can quite believe what Hirsch is saying in here in relation to the church in China. In a persecuted area, a time of persecution, you're not going to have seeker-sensitive services, are you? Because to come to a group of people who are meeting illegally is to invite the wrath of your authoritarian regime, whether it's the Romans or the Chinese authorities, down on your head in a way that mean you could lose your job, you could lose your opportunities for the future, you could lose your home, you could lose your family, you could lose your liberty, you could lose your life. And if that's the case, those types of things have no relevance, do they? Now, of course, we don't live currently under persecution. We don't live in a culture where seeker-friendly activities would not work. And that's part of our challenge, I think, in the quote-unquote free West that we live in. And the liberties we enjoy make us think, well, actually, we don't want persecution just so that we can move on with God. We want to be taken from gleaning from here. What are the God principles that come through all this that say to us, actually, there's a way forward that does not need a framework that we construct of human origin that is done in human strength and needs human strength to perpetuate. And that is the great challenge, I think, when we set up these organizational structures that are good ideas, but not necessarily God ideas. We have to then sustain the movement of God through our own strength. And that is exhausting and ultimately impossible. Youth groups, worship bands, seminaries, commentaries, and so on. Now, I have some commentaries on the shelves behind me. I'm a great believer in learning from the learning of other people. And it's been hugely beneficial to me over the years. I'm not knocking that. I'm simply saying that actually in terms of a raw move of God, we want to be people who are going with the power of God and the Spirit of God. What is the Spirit of God saying to us in this season? Sixthly, he says this, they actually made it hard to join the church. Now, in the late 2nd century, for example, it was harder and harder for people to come into this baptismal community of people joining for faith, partly because those who were Christians wanted to make sure that those who were coming in were actually on board with them and not going to bring persecution for understandable reasons. I suspect that was true in China. I remember reading in the 80s about the persecuted church in Russia, where sometimes people came to faith supposedly, but they were in fact KGB plants. And once those effectively like spies had been welcomed into the church community, then betrayed that community to the authorities. We've always, certainly in our church, felt that we want a low bar on people coming along. We have a high bar on leadership. I still think that's a good idea. But of course, just attending meetings is not the same as really belonging. It's not really the same as just joining in, into to that more intimate level where we actually do life together. Recently, in our own family, with some friends I was talking to recently on the phone, and then earlier in July, or the end of July this year, when we met with some friends of ours in another part of the county, and we just spent time together and we fellowshiped together. It was, I think it was actually a Sunday, but we had lunch out in the garden in the afternoon, and we thought, well, this is community, this is church, this is not organized, this is not part of a strategy, it's just us doing life together. And it seems to me as we think about going back, do we really want to go back? I think for me, I feel that we want to go forward. And in going forward, we take some of the things from the past and we run with them. But we also open ourselves up to what God has for the future. And so what are those things? What are the things we pick up from the past? What are the things we run into and embrace which are new to us for this next season of our lives? Well, I'm not going to say what I think they are, partly because I don't know, even for ourselves, what those things are. And I think they'll be different for each person in each person's individual context. It would depend on whether you are leading a group of Christians, or you are a member of a group, or you are on your own. I would encourage you, though, to think through some of these things and say, well, what is indispensable? In fact, I challenged our own church on Sunday morning at our regular Zoom service that we now have since coronavirus. And so what are the indispensable ingredients? What is the irreducible minimum that makes church, this ecclesia that God has called us into, this revolutionary movement? What is an irreducible minimum beyond which we say, well, that is no longer church? And we may find that is much smaller than we realise. So one of the things that I have thought about over the last few months in terms of what we may miss from the past is this sense of corporate worship. And it's because I think I've been caught up in, and this is not necessarily a wrong thing, it's just an observation, but this idea of the musical side of worship, and I'm a musical person, so I love music. It's been part of my life for decades. But that aspect of being close to God through musical worship is part of who I am. But I can do that at just the same level when I play the piano in our living room and there's nobody else around. I can worship God just as much when I'm out walking on the beach or down a country lane with our dog every day. There is something about worshipping together, I think, and that perhaps is what we miss. It's not the music, it's not the band, it's not the songs. We love the new songs, we love the old hymns, we love all of that. And yet I think intrinsically it's not the music, and it's not even our hymnody. It's actually the fact that together we are expressing worship to God. So what other ways are there for us individually and together, even in COVID, to express our worship to God? We were recently at a funeral, and because of COVID-19 restrictions, there were no hymns that could be sung. So the hymns were printed in the order of service, as would normally be the case. And the organist played the hymns, and we followed through the words on our hymn sheet, and we read them at the same time as the music played. And that was different. But in its own way, it was equally as meaningful. Recently, our son got married, and at the service, which was a cut-down version of what they would have had we not had the restrictions, there were no songs to sing. But during the signing of the register, hymns were played. And for those of us who knew the hymns and had grown up knowing these hymns all our lives, it's almost as if we were singing along in our heads in this beautiful Anglican building in Suffolk. And God is able to work in these amazing ways throughout COVID, through different avenues, if you like, by bringing us to a place of relationship with Him. Now, that could be true for worship, it could be true for Bible teaching, it could be true for discipleship. So what I want to encourage you to think about is, what is the irreducible minimum for ecclesia to be ecclesia? What is just a trimming? And don't forget, trimmings are not bad necessarily, but neither are they essential. What is God calling us to in this new season? What would it look like if people simply met in their homes? What would it look like if the coming together happened maybe once a month or once a term, or infrequently anyway, certainly not every week in a corporate setting, but we came together from time to time for that general encouragement and worship, but we met together in our homes, we discipled in our homes, we ate meals together. Now, I appreciate that in the current restrictions that is very difficult. Here in the UK, certainly in England at the minute, we're able to have 6 people in a home, which is a very small dinner party. But we can, where we're at, start now with the small and see what God will do. We can pray for our streets, our neighbourhoods. Earlier on during the COVID crisis, here in the UK, on a Thursday night at 8 p.m, people came out on their streets and they clapped for the emergency services, particularly those in the medical fields, the National Health Service, because people realised that those working in hospitals and clinics were at the forefront of the battle against coronavirus. They were helping people at the end of their lives. They were saving some people's lives. They were in the thick of it. And people wanted to appreciate that. So we came out on a couple of occasions and stood at our end of our drive and we clapped. And I saw people and waved at people and smiled at people that live very close to us that we never, ever otherwise see. Because we're so busy traveling here, there and everywhere, going to church, doing Christian activities. And maybe God wants us to simply be the church, to be ecclesia in our community. What if God wants us just to work in an area that we can walk to, instead of having to drive to? Because if you live out in the countryside, what you can walk to, there may be a very small number of people. If you live in a big city, what you can do in 2 or 3 mile radius, you might be meeting hundreds or even thousands of people. And it will depend on where you are. It depends what God has called you to. All I'm saying is, why don't you think outside the box? Why don't you say, God, well, in this unprecedented time, we got so sick of the word unprecedented at the beginning when the politicians were bringing it out time and time again. But the reality is that God has given us an unprecedented opportunity that we don't want to miss. We don't want to look back and say, God gave us this window of opportunity, and instead of going through the window into something else, we just shut it, drew the curtains, and said, let's go back to the good old days. We sometimes call them halcyon days, those good old days of the past. Well, there were some good things in the past, no question. And do we learn from that? Absolutely. But what of the past do we want to leave in the past? And what do we want to take with us into this new season? That's the challenge. That's a real challenge. So think about it. Drop me a line if you've got some views. If you think I'm completely off the straight and narrow, let me know. I'm happy to have a conversation about it. We want to be asking the questions, though, that are often not asked. What is the point? Endless activity? What does it ultimately achieve? These are important questions to ask. And I think you'll find that sometimes activity, when done in the power of God and led by the grace of God, is hugely impactful and hugely important. But we need to discern what's a good idea, what's an historical idea, and what is a God idea for this new season. Hope you have a great week. Be blessed. If you are up for a good read, Alan Hirsch, The Forgotten Ways, Reactivating Apostolic Movements, is a good read. It's not an easy read, but it's a good read. And if you want to be challenged by that or by something like Francis Chan's book on Letters to the Church, I suggest you get this from Amazon, have a read, and let me know what you think. In the meantime, be blessed as you are church in these exciting and wonderful days full of God's opportunity. The window is open. Are you going to go through it, or will you shut it and draw the curtains?